I don't think that the Labour Party take ecological issues seriously. Progressive governments around the world, and you may soon have a Labour government in the UK, are doing the minimum they can get away with. They're still taking money from fossil fuel companies. We just had a fossil fuels conference that some of my friends protested at, and our Labour government was so annoyed by that they've now introduced a law where protesters can be fined $50,000 or sent to prison for 3 months. We have to get past this idea that governments cannot fund the energy transition or investments in ecological sustainability generally. It will need an MMT perspective to bring that about. There's still time to do something about it.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And it's our absolute privilege to welcome back friend of the show, economist, teacher, author of Economics for Sustainable Prosperity, founder of the groundbreaking Modern Money Lab, which we'll talk about later, but most importantly, the man who introduced me to Patricia Pino. So it's all his fault. It's our absolute pleasure to welcome back to the show Professor Stephen Hale. Thanks for joining us today, Stephen.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I wasn't aware of the fact that I'd introduced you to Patricia Pino.
You did, yeah. Yeah, it was via Facebook, because I remember saying to you, you've got Bill Mitchell over there and you've had Steve Keen, and who's over here? And you said, I can introduce you to my friend Patricia, if you like. So on with the show. The big theme of the week is that central banks all over the world are still raising interest rates, supposedly to fight inflation, but it seems to be having the opposite effect. Over there in Australia, Stephen, I believe recently the central bank governor told people who couldn't handle the cost of living crisis to just move back in with their parents. And Stephen, as an economist who's trained central bank operatives, I imagine you've got some thoughts about monetary policy, interest rates, inflation, all that jazz. So please start anywhere, sound off, go for it.
I don't think that using short-term interest rates or policy interest rates the way central banks have done for the last 30 years is the most effective way of managing inflation for a variety of reasons. One of those is that to the extent there is a link between the interest rates and the inflation rate at all, it's a very indirect one. The monetary system is a complex system, and interest rates have a variety of effects on the economy via the monetary system. Those effects are often lagged effects, and sometimes they have the opposite effects that central bankers believe they do, for reasons that I think Christian and Patricia, you already know about, because you've spoken to Warren Mosley on more than one occasion. He's a much bigger expert in this area than I am.
Well, I mean, we could just dig into that for a second. In terms of monetary policy, MMT proponents generally advise against raising interest rates to fight inflation. What's your interpretation of that?
When interest rates go up, as I was saying before, it has a variety of effects on the economy. So higher interest rates tend to put, at least temporarily, downward pressure on asset prices like share prices. And eventually, if you push interest rates up far enough, they'll have a negative impact on property prices too. higher interest rates can have at least a temporary impact on the exchange rate as well. And if the US is raising interest rates over time, then in a smaller open economy like Australia, central bankers feel under pressure to put interest rates up too. Otherwise, they're concerned that there'll be downward pressure on the currency and so on import prices.
When the Fed takes the lead and raises interest rates, and like you say, a smaller open economy like Australia feels the pressure to follow suit, that's because
currency traders believe that if there is a change in relative interest rates, or even if they anticipate a change in relative interest rates, if they anticipate that US interest rates will rise relative to Australian ones, it is a conventional belief that others will move out of the Australian dollar and into the US dollar, and the US dollar will appreciate and the Australian dollar will depreciate. And if you don't anticipate that and move funds yourself, you'll make a loss. Now, the evidence that there is a permanent impact or a long-term impact on the exchange rate from small movements in relative interest rates is non-existent. But nonetheless, there is the general view among speculators that this is the way the foreign exchange market works, and consequently, temporarily, it often does work that way.
I was just going to ask, that's pure bandwagon effect. They think it's going to go up and they don't want to miss out.
Yeah, John Harvey calls it forecast construction bias. There is actually no evidence at all the differences between national interest rates in high-income countries is at all useful when it comes to forecasting movements in exchange rates over time. Not if you're not just looking over the next few days anyway. But traders don't believe that. Traders think interest rates have a significant impact on the foreign exchange market. They only have perhaps a 7-day time horizon. They're concerned about losing money over the next 7 days. And so it can be the case that it's not necessarily the change in interest rates. It's an anticipation, expectation that relative interest rates are going to change. It can lead to a flow of funds between currencies, and it can have a temporary impact on the foreign exchange market. The interesting thing is the difference between the US and countries like Australia or the UK, because Warren often says that higher interest rates actually boost demand and, if anything, would put upward pressure on inflation because of the effect on demand. And he's talking there about the fact that higher interest rates mean that the biggest net payer of interest in the US, which is the US federal government, ends up paying more interest to people that own its bonds over time. So an increase in interest rates is equivalent to a fiscal stimulus. And in the US, that's much more likely to be a dominant effect than it is in the UK or in Australia. And that's because, well, it's for a variety of reasons, but particularly because in the US, most people have fixed rate mortgages. And those fixed rate mortgages are fixed across the life of the mortgage. So an increase in interest rates, although it'll have an impact on somebody taking out a mortgage freshly now, it doesn't have an impact on the disposable income of people who already have mortgages on the whole, because their mortgages are at fixed interest rates. Whereas in Australia, most mortgages are variable rate. So in Australia, when the RBA, when our central bank puts interest rates up, it has a bigger impact on people that have big mortgages, because most of them have variable rate mortgages. Those variable rates adjust. The cost of servicing their mortgages gets greater, and so they're more likely to cut back on their spending. So it's more likely that an increase in interest rates will have a negative impact on spending in Australia than in the US. But because the US leads global central banks, so what the Fed does, generally speaking, is what most other central banks do around the world. The Fed might increase rates further than you perhaps would do in Australia in the absence of changes in monetary policy in the US. And because we have a different set of circumstances, it's more likely to push the Australian economy towards a recession than the US economy.
So in the UK, you mentioned the effect of high interest rates as a fiscal stimulus might be less than in the US. But in the UK, we have index-linked gilts, index gilts. So as soon as inflation goes up, without any need of the interest rates actually increasing, the repayments on these gilts goes up immediately. And I think that I don't have the exact proportion right now, but there were quite a few reports of these gilts adding quite a lot of strain onto government finances when inflation started being a problem. So I'm just wondering whether you know anything about that and what mechanisms may be at play there.
That's not something I've thought about really, Patricia, but yes, any index-linked payments will increase when there's upward pressure on the price index, which they're linked to. So yes, there's potential for that to be a source of stimulus as well. Again, in the UK, it's a bit different to Australia. You have to look at balance sheets. That's the thing. You have to look at the detail of the monetary system, because the UK government has much more, if we're going to use the word debt, has much more debt than the Australian government does. So there's less of an increase in interest payments between the public sector and the private sector over time, following an increase in what we call the target cash rate here, than there is following an increase in the bank rate in the UK. So the point is that changes in interest rates have different effects on different economies, and anything simple that anybody says is almost certainly going to be misleading and in some countries just wrong.
There's no one-size-fits-all rule, basically.
There isn't, and it's complicated, because while higher interest rates means if you've got a variable rate mortgage, you're going to be squeezed and you're going to be cutting back on your spending. For elderly people like me who don't have a mortgage anymore but have money in term deposits, our disposable income goes up, and that slightly offsets the effect. And then, of course, we've got the supply side effect, which is often completely ignored, which is the fact that interest rates are a business cost. And so the immediate impact of an increase in interest rates is to actually put the price level up, not down, because businesses react to increases in their costs if they're pricing with a fixed margin by increasing their prices. And in Australia, earlier this year, the biggest contributor towards our inflation rate was rising rents, and higher interest rates when you've got variable rate mortgages puts upward pressure on rents too. So we've got all these effects all muddled in together. And consequently, the idea that you can treat interest rates like the brake or the accelerator on your car, and that a small change in interest rates up or down is going to allow you efficiently to manage inflationary pressures in your economy via managing the rate of growth of aggregate demand is nonsensical. And what tends to happen is that where there is an impact on demand, it happens with a lag, and central banks tend to overreact, because this is something I really wish wasn't the case. Most central banks make decisions on policy interest rates monthly or virtually monthly, and consequently they tend to nudge rates when inflation is above their target range up and up and up and up, and they basically go too far. And you end up with a crisis arising, an incipient crisis arising somewhere within the financial system. We've had, of course, in the US, the issues with Silicon Valley Bank. In previous occasions of monetary policy tightening, we've had mortgage defaults triggering a financial crisis, of course. We've had, going back to the early 1980s and the Volcker experiment in the US, we had a global banking crisis because of global South governments having accumulated large amounts of variable interest rate US dollar debt that was linked to the policy interest rate, the federal funds rate in the US. So basically, they overreact until something breaks.
Yeah, there's that quasi-rhyming couplet, isn't there? That the Fed raises rates until something breaks.
Yeah, and it would be much better if the policy rate was low and stable and just left the same. And the founders of modern monetary theory, generally speaking, say that the natural interest rate is zero, by which they mean that if governments deficit spend and consequently banks end up with excess reserves, private banks end up with excess reserves at the central bank, then if the central bank doesn't pay interest on those reserves, the federal funds rate or the cash rate here or the bank rate in the UK would be zero, and it would just stay at zero. I'm not necessarily wedded to a permanent interest rate of zero, but I do think interest rates should just be left low and stable. I pointed out on Twitter the other day that between the 1720s and the 1820s, the bank rate of the Bank of England was 5% for more than 100 years and never changed once. And we should be using other mechanisms for trying to manage inflation, which are more effective. We shouldn't be having central banks messing about with policy interest rates. Leave it at zero, or leave it at what seems at a fair and appropriate level, given that an important consequence of your interest rate decision is the extent to which income is redistributed between debtors and creditors over time. So make a decision about what's the appropriate place to set interest rates than just leave them where they are and use other mechanisms for managing inflation.
Who knew the golden era of monetary policy was 1720 to 1822?
I'm not saying it was. I certainly don't want to return to the dark days of the Industrial Revolution and the beginnings of the modern British Empire and all that.
But some child labour in there as well.
Absolutely. But it just makes the point. We haven't always had central banks nudging interest rates. And post-Second World War, interest rates were stable over decades as well. We didn't have this approach to policy that we now have.
It's interesting what you said just a few moments ago about this idea that an active, in a new Keynesian style, active fiscal policy can actually be more destabilizing than it can actually help, because they don't really understand what the relationship between interest rates is. And I seem to recall a similar argument being made by the monetarists a few decades back. But of course, they were saying active fiscal policy costs more trouble than it's worth. But their argument was that we couldn't do anything about inflation. We should just let it be. Whereas the distinction is that we're saying fiscal policy is the way to take care of this, not monetary policy.
Monetarists used to believe that central banks could control the money supply. And if you could control the money supply, you could control spending. And if you could control spending in an economy which was always by definition close to full employment, that would be the same thing as controlling the price level, the old quantity theory of money. Virtually everything in that sentence was wrong. And people like Milton Friedman just didn't understand how banking worked. They never did. And it's amazing that they were as influential eventually as they came to be. That's why they gave up targeting measures of the money supply in the 1980s, because first of all, they found that they couldn't control the money supply anyway, because as we know, the money supply is determined endogenously in the economy. When private banks lend to people, it increases the money supply and they don't have to ask the central bank's permission to do that, first of all. But secondly, when they tried to set targets for the rate of growth of the money supply to control inflation, there was no link between changes in the rate of growth of different measures of the money supply and inflation anyway. So they abandoned trying to do that in the early 1990s, and they decided to set inflation targets instead and to try to manage inflation the way they've done ever since, by manipulating policy interest rates or short-term interest rates for that reason. They actually, of course, got inflation down by introducing during the 80s and 90s the form of globalization we ended up with, so that basically the workers around the world found themselves faced with low-wage labor in China and India and elsewhere and being forced to compete for their jobs, and so having no bargaining power anymore, having lived through 10 or 15 years of mass unemployment or underemployment or insecure employment. And since then, we've had the development of the gig economy, and we've had changes in industrial relations legislation and a variety of other factors, and the development of complex global value chains so that businesses can move employment from country to country looking for cheap labor. That's what's kept inflation down, alongside cheap energy most of the time up until recently. And it wasn't tremendously skillful monetary policy on the part of central banks at all. That was a myth.
Since the financial crisis up until COVID, they were actually trying to get inflation up because they were undershooting the 2% target and failing. I remember Warren at the time saying, has it occurred to anybody maybe central banks aren't actually that good at creating inflation?
Absolutely. Same thing in Australia as well. For 4 years out of 5 before the pandemic struck, the Reserve Bank missed its inflation target on the low side. And they tried everything, didn't they? They cut interest rates to zero. Then, first of all, in Denmark and Sweden, and then in a variety of other countries, they tried negative official interest rates. They tried very large scale, what people sometimes called quantitative easing, which was basically an asset swap where the central bank put additional reserves into private bank reserve accounts in return for government bonds and sometimes private securities as well. The Japanese central bank even started buying shares on the stock market to flood the banking system with reserves, and they were completely unable to create inflation. What we've then had, of course, is the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse since then, and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have put some upward pressure on the price level. And, of course, there's been controversy recently about the extent to which the subsequent, let's say, persistent inflation has been a consequence of fiscal and monetary support during and after the pandemic, or to the extent it's been mainly, as I believe, and as I think the evidence clearly indicates, it's been because of something else.
Yeah. On the money mechanics side of things and interest rates and how central banks go about manipulating interest rates, I remember about a year ago, I wrote on Twitter, whatever people think raising interest rates will do to demand, what it will definitely do is increase the flow of interest income, as we were talking about before, Stephen, from the government to the private sector, because the government is a net payer of interest to the non-government. And you replied, to be fair, it does take a long while to do that. Could you lay that out for us, how that works?
It does, at least outside of periods of large-scale quantitative easing. When there's been large-scale quantitative easing, banks have very high levels of excess reserves at the central bank. And when the policy interest rate goes up, the interest rate the central bank pays on those excess reserves goes up straight away. So there's an immediate impact. But where we're talking about higher interest rates on bonds held in the private sector, those bonds are fixed coupon bonds. Now, we don't want to go through bond pricing all over again. If people are interested, we spent at least 2 programs talking about mechanics of bond pricing some time ago.
I'll link to those in the show notes.
Once those bonds are being auctioned by the Treasury, then the interest payments on those are fixed for the life of the bonds. So if we were talking about bonds that have been issued with a 10-year maturity, then it's not until that bond issue rolls over at the end of 10 years that any change in interest rates is going to be reflected in an increase in payments between the government and the private sector.
So raising interest rates to a central banker is all about fighting inflation, no matter what the facts are or what the data shows, no matter that the Fed officials themselves, one ex-Fed governor once said, they have no reliable theory of inflation.
Well, let's be fair to them. They've been given responsibility for something that they have no power to control.
Yes, yeah.
So you can't really blame them in some respects.
Actually, I think we can blame them for coming across posture-wise as though they are controlling inflation.
Yeah, they don't admit they don't have control over it, do they?
Yeah, and especially when you've got insiders coming out from the inside and saying, we have no reliable theory of inflation. I think at that point, it looks like, no, they are actually just venally hanging on to their jobs.
They do sort of have a mechanism for controlling inflation, just to step back a little bit. And that is that as long as people believe that they're able to influence the inflation rate, they will be able to. So there's the expectations mechanism.
Yeah, which a few episodes ago we interviewed Randall Ray, who'd written this piece with Stephanie Kelton about it's all based on pixie dust. It's almost like the pixie dust theory of interest rates. But anyway, we say the remedy for rising prices should depend on where those price rises are coming from. And on that front, there's a relatively new development. The newspapers are calling it greedflation. Isabella Weber calls it seller's inflation. My favourite word for it is excuseflation.
I've heard her use that word as well, excuseflation.
Yeah, I think that's the closest thing to seller's inflation, and it sums up what it is. And I like that excuseflation was invented by 2 Bloomberg presenters who invented the word, wrote an article about it, and then paywalled it, which I thought was a very elegant demonstration of price-setting power in and of itself. So very meta. But anyway, what are we talking about here, Stephen? What's your preferred word for it?
Seller's inflation or excuseflation is fine by me. What I like is Isabella Weber is a brilliant economist. I think she's the most brilliant economist to emerge in the last 2 years. I have enjoyed a sort of debate between her and the very well-known post-Keynesian economist Mark Leroy recently. And I've enjoyed that in part because they are both arguing from an approach to understanding how prices are set in the economy, which is grounded in the realistic, institutional or post-Keynesian theory of pricing, which was developed really back in the 1930s and which was very influential during and after the Second World War, when you mentioned to me before this podcast or in an email about strategic price controls. They played a part in the management of inflation during the successful management of inflation during and immediately after the Second World War. And they were influenced by work done by a group of economists in something called the Oxford Economist Research Group in the 1930s, led by somebody called Philip Andrews and others. And they were the first people really to talk about strategic interdependence in pricing, which is what Isabella Weber is talking about when she talks about coordination in price increases between firms at the moment. And they also draw on the work of Michel Kalecki, Keynes' contemporary, on pricing and on income distribution. And they've had a little bit of an argument about it. And what we need to explain is how the upward pressure on the price level around the world, which initially was a consequence of the pandemic and supply chain disruptions down to the pandemic, and also, of course, the war between Ukraine and Russia, and the impact of climate change on agriculture in some parts of the world in the last year, how that's been persistent and how it's been associated with increases in profit margins in some industries and a significant increase in the share of profits in gross domestic product and a fall in the share of wages in gross domestic product. And if you are Marc Lavoie, then you explain that by pointing out that in the sector of the economy where prices are administered, which is the manufacturing sector and the tertiary sector, where prices are not set by demand and supply, but they're set by businesses taking their unit costs and adding on a profit margin, where the profit margin they add on depends on the degree of competition they face or the degree of monopoly power that they enjoy, what they expect their competitors to do and what they believe their customers will tolerate. When sales increase, when capacity utilization increases, unit costs fall because businesses basically have constant, what we call average variable costs, constant unaccountable called direct costs, but overheads or fixed costs get split across a greater and greater quantity of output as you approach full capacity. And businesses in these sectors usually have excess capacity for a variety of reasons. So if you're Marc Lavoie, what has happened is that many businesses are operating closer to full capacity. And as a consequence of operating closer to full capacity, their profit margin has increased because they are pricing by adding a markup on their direct costs. So when their costs have increased as a result of those disruptions we were talking about before, that automatically leads them to equiproportionately increase their prices. But their overheads or their fixed costs per unit have been falling. So when you look at their profit margin overall, including their fixed costs, they get a bigger profit margin than before. And this is not greedflation. This is just being closer to full capacity. The other thing Marc Lavoie says is that when you look at Michel Kalecki's theory of income distribution, it explains that when prices rise in the primary sector part of the economy, in energy and materials, which the secondary sector, the manufacturing sector, uses as inputs, and after all, the tertiary sector depends on the secondary sector, and the secondary sector depends on the primary sector in our economies, then when you look at post-Keynesian price theory, if you've got firms in the secondary sector which are just taking their costs and adding on a fixed margin as before, as I was saying before, then if you look at the share in non-primary sector GDP of profits and wages, then the share of profits rises for that reason. And again, it's not greedflation. So Marc Lavoie, I haven't explained it very well, but if you want to look it up, that's been Marc Lavoie's argument. He said, actually, it's not necessarily greed that we're looking at here. It's what's happened in the primary sector feeding through the secondary and tertiary sectors of the economy. And to an extent, it can also be that businesses are closer to full capacity than normal. But Isabella Weber, of course, and this makes much more sense and I think fits the data very nicely.
And she's very quick to correct anybody in interviews that says greedflation coming from her. She will say, no, I call it seller's inflation.
She has the same theoretical background as Marc Lavoie. So like Marc Lavoie, she'd talk about prices in the primary sector of the economy being that you can explain based on demand and supply, albeit in primary industries. They're often distorted by a high degree of concentration and also often heavily influenced by speculation on futures markets. But it is the case that if there is a supply disruption in agriculture or in the energy sector, then it's very difficult if supply is disrupted in one part of the global economy for supply to increase rapidly elsewhere to make up the difference. So if there's a decrease in supply, it will put upward pressure on the prices that businesses in the primary sector are able to charge. But then in the secondary and tertiary sector, we are talking about pricing based on cost plus a margin. And she points out that in the secondary and tertiary sectors across most high-income countries, sellers' prices have gone up by more than their costs. And they've gone up by more than their costs, she says, in part because the shock has created an environment where sellers have had an opportunity to build margin. Firstly, because there's more social license, because when people have got used to the idea that your costs have increased and so your prices are having to increase anyway, it's easy in what is an uncertain and confusing environment to increase price relative to costs and build margin. And secondly, because whereas under normal circumstances, you will be restricted from raising your prices to build margin because you'll be concerned about a loss of market share, because you'll be concerned that your rivals won't follow your lead and build margin when you do. Under present circumstances, businesses are much more confident that their competitors are doing exactly the same as they do. So customers will put up with it. There's a social license to put your price up. People will be confused. They're not clear whether you're just increasing price in line with cost and it's all justified, or whether you're going further than that and deliberately choosing to increase your price rather than to increase your volume of sales further. And the strategic interdependence issue is less of a problem too. So all these factors help businesses to put their prices up more. And then they transparently boast about it later on when they have their annual general meeting and they put out their results and talk about how profitable they are now. In Australia, we've had that with lots of our big companies, Qantas, the banks, our big food retailers. They've all been boasting about how profitable they've been recently. And basically, those profits have been because they put their prices up more than their costs.
I think from understanding her argument about it, I think if I can simplify it in my head a little bit, because she models the economy, as we said, as a set of interconnected prices, the way I see it, when you have a shock in one particular commodity, say in energy, and I think she had a paper in which she explicitly modeled energy, because energy is part of the production in so many other industries, a cost increase travels through all these other industries and manifests through these other industries. And I think that what came across as interesting to me is that aside from a generalized price increase that you see on the other side, you also see changes in the price distribution between industries. So basically you get some industries that increase more than others. So the whole kind of some are winners and some are losers relative to each other in a sense. And because of that, as you say, even if we were to say, okay, the energy companies or the finance industry is being, raising prices by more than what it costs them, and we can call that greed inflation, then other industries are simply adjusting their prices based on their increased costs. And we cannot label that as greed inflation. And therefore, maybe that's where she doesn't want to generalize.
Absolutely. You just put it much better than I did before.
I think her shunning the greedflation thing and not shunning excuseflation is that through media and, let's just say mass media, I'm sure there are other channels, when we hear, there's a grain price shock or something like that, it almost gives the sellers permission to raise prices together. If they don't do it in unison, somebody's going to look bad. If there's no pretext for it, the seller is going to look bad. But the price shock that's well publicized, well known about, is giving them permission or an excuse to raise prices for sellers.
Absolutely. But Patricia, maybe think of some jargon that ecological economists use. They say that the structure of the economy is trophic, by which they mean, as I mentioned before, that the tertiary sector services depend on the secondary sector and the primary sector. If you're involved in the services industry, you're using goods which have been produced in the secondary sector of the economy. And of course, the secondary sector of the economy, manufacturing, uses inputs, including energy, from the primary sector of the economy. And this shock, the main impact of the shocks that we've been through was on the primary sector of the economy. And then increases in primary sector prices and increases in energy and food prices and minerals prices feeds through the other sectors of the economy over time. In Australia, we have seen our primary sector businesses, particularly our fossil fuel businesses, become enormously profitable. They've been allowed to become enormously profitable as a result of this shock, especially as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war. But Patricia just mentioned something which is consistent with the evidence published by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In the secondary and tertiary sectors, it's really only the very large businesses with a lot of monopoly power that have been able to build profit margin. Other businesses in general have not. They've just raised their prices in line with costs, or sometimes not as much as that. So I mentioned the food retailers. We have two really big food retailers in Australia called Woolworths and Coles. They've been profitable. We have a virtual monopolist, or this is a duopolist, but the dominant firm within that duopoly, Qantas, which has been able to build profits by basically, in its case, pushing its prices up when its costs rose, but then when its costs fell, not bringing its prices back down again and leaving them higher. So we've seen these kind of businesses build profit margin over time. And what that has done is it's made the inflation more persistent than it would otherwise been, and perhaps amplified it as well. But it's not general across the economy. The other thing that came to mind is another possible problem with greedflation is that actually, of course, this is really the executives of businesses behaving in the way that economists have told them they ought to behave for the last 50 years. They're supposed to represent shareholders' interests. And representing shareholders' interests is supposed to be about making as much profit as you possibly can.
In fact, that's the social responsibility of a firm, as a person who got everything else wrong once said.
I'm sure that's the way that they would see it.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener. And we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. So because we've started talking about ecological economics a little bit, let's turn that corner and not lose sight of the fact that the reason many of us have had to become interested in how the money system works is because we recognize there are several planetary emergencies going on, and that's what your work on the economics of sustainability is focused on. Now, over here in the UK yesterday, Rachel Reeves, the shadow chancellor, was on the BBC, and she announced she was going to delay her previously stated plan to borrow, quote unquote, borrow £28 billion a year for a so-called green prosperity fund, which she'd pledged to set up if Labour won the next election. The former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who's not supportive of the U-turn, commented the argument being put forward by Rachel Reeves is that the bond markets will react to Labour's proposed borrowing if they got into power, like they responded to Liz Truss's mini-budget. And as he puts it, this would make the necessary borrowing too expensive to deal with. But anyway, what's your response to that, Stephen?
There's so many things wrong with that. I almost don't know where to begin, really.
Yeah, I'm sorry to dump all that on you.
I don't think that the Labour Party you've got at the moment there, and the Australian Labour Party, I don't honestly think most of the leadership take ecological issues seriously. I don't think they take climate change seriously. I don't think they've caught on yet. I don't think they realise that we are on the brink of a catastrophe. There's still time to do something about it, but every year you hope that there's going to be a significant change in the narrative. I hope we might have a Bernie Sanders in the White House, for example. We really are in a pickle. We've got, just to have a 50% chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, we would have, based on our current annual emissions, 8 to 9 years. And then we would have used up our entire budget of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. If you wanted to be 66% sure of it, Will Steffen, a famous climate scientist who sadly died a few months ago, but used to be at the ANU in Australia, he was saying not all that long ago that we've got 4 years left. I've talked to climate scientists. I've asked people, normally in science, we talk about 95% confidence. And what they've come back and said, well, that's gone already. If we were to stop any net emissions tomorrow, you couldn't be 95% or even 90% certain that we weren't going to go for a long period of time above 1.5 degrees global warming anyway, maybe above 2 degrees global warming. I don't know how people, I've got friends who are in XR and in the scientist version of XR, and they're becoming desperate now because Labour governments around the world, progressive governments around the world, and you may soon have a Labour government in the UK, are doing the minimum they can get away with. They're still taking money from fossil fuel companies. They're not taking this seriously. And that's basically where we are in Australia. We have a government which is better than the previous government, but they are taking now, I think, more money from fossil fuel companies than the Conservatives are in Australia now. And they're doing the absolute bare minimum. In the state I live in, we just had a fossil fuels conference that some of my friends protested at. And our Labour government was so annoyed by that they've now introduced a law with the support of the Conservatives over here, where instead of a tiny fine for protesting, and protesters can be fined $50,000 or sent to prison for 3 months for blocking the highway.
Last week we were speaking to Pavlina and I said, I think what we're asking for is for governments to treat us like they would treat banks and protect us and take the instability out of our lives. And over there it might be like, can the government please treat us like you would coal? That we're a precious thing to be cherished.
They're still opening new coal mines and we're still opening new gas fields. And people say, oh, you drive a car sometimes, or I'm going to be flying to Europe later on in the year. And people can say, oh, you're a hypocrite, but maybe there's an element of truth in that. I don't know.
But we cannot shop our way out of it. It's a systemic thing that needs a political solution. It's not like if everybody just stops flying or everybody buys a Prius, we're going to turn this thing around.
The thing that puzzles me is that the response to the protest is entirely disproportionate. And they have a history of doing that now, of passing laws for absurd penalties for protesting, doing anything like that. But I don't see mass outrage from ordinary people to the government's response. And I do wonder if the government is able to get away with these things because to some extent they've got the support of ordinary people in their response to these protests. And I know this is in economics, but I do wonder how, obviously we need to protest, but how effective are we being in our choice of protest?
I sometimes worry that it's going to take a major Australian capital city to burn down. And I live in a capital city which is dangerous. We are going back into El Nino. Goodness knows what the next El Nino is going to be. I've been evacuated from my home once. We're just going back into El Nino now. The last couple of years we've been in a La Nina, which in some parts of the world creates more dry weather and more bushfires like we've seen in Canada recently. But an El Nino is when we get that in the bottom right-hand corner of Australia, which is one of the world's most fire-prone places and where I happen to live. The good news is that people like Mark Diesendorf, who is a friend of mine, who's a an ecological economist and a specialist in renewable energy tell me that it's not too late for us to do something about this. If we had governments around the world that had more aggressive targets in terms of electrifying the economy and moving towards renewable energy and everything else which is necessary to build a sustainable, what you might call green infrastructure.
And on that topic, sorry to jump in, Stephen, this brings us back to the money mechanics, because what we hear now, our Labour Party isn't even in power at the moment, so they can promise things without being held to account. And they're still backing down from it.
No, they're worried that they can't.
Yeah. As you started out to say a few beats ago, Stephen, you said, I don't think they actually appreciate the scale of the crisis, of the emergency, and they're acting accordingly. Actually, they don't want to do it. And what they reach for is, oh God, we'd love to transition to a sustainable system of production and distribution over here, but bond yields are going to stop us doing that because markets won't like it. And that's something we can address, I think. It used to be, oh, the government's going to run out of money. Now, thanks to your work and a lot of other grassroots people, and of course, the mighty Stephanie Kelton's The Deficit Myth and the best-selling status of that, and her work in politics, I'm thinking it's moved from we're going to run out of money to, the markets won't like it. Bond yields will shoot up. What do you say to that?
To what extent is an excuse? To what extent is it a lack of understanding of the monetary system? I really don't know. I'm not inside the heads of these people and their advisors.
But I'm saying that we need to put a flame under the political representatives every time they bring up this. Look what happened to Liz Truss. Bond markets are in control of your political system.
Absolutely. Well, bizarrely, of course, in the UK, under the Bank of England Act, if only she'd known it and if she'd had backbench support, if Liz Truss disagreed with the governor of the Bank of England, Liz Truss would have won.
Yeah.
But perhaps she wasn't aware of that. She could have overruled the governor of the Bank of England. There would have been some temporary downward pressure on the pound, but I don't think it would have been significant. Not that I wanted her to get her way because of the absurd tax cuts that she was suggesting going ahead with.
But it has now cowed anybody from having any kind of ambitious spending plan now.
I suppose so, which is one reason why we have to keep talking about modern monetary theory. What I've been doing in recent years is talking to ecological economists like Mark Diesendorf and discussing MMT with them and trying to explain to them, not to Mark, he understood this very well, that they really need to understand the monetary system. Otherwise, they're not going to be in a position to achieve the things that they would like to achieve, which are very important for us to achieve. But at the same time, we've been talking for years now, and I do think that the narrative has changed a little bit in the MMT community, to the MMT community in saying, you talk about monetary sovereign governments having only real constraints and not financial constraints. But I don't think you fully understand what the real constraints are. The ultimate real constraints are ecological constraints. And the notion that it's not a problem to grow the economy as quickly as we possibly can, because without driving inflation up, because deficit spending is not an issue for financial reasons, and all you need to do is ensure that you build your productive capacity quickly enough over time so that inflation doesn't take off, which is similar to some of the old post-Keynesian prescription for running economies after the Second World War. That's not a feasible prescription for the next generation. I think in 5 years' time, the discussion will have completely changed. I think MMT will be accepted broadly, although we might not call it modern monetary theory. But I'm absolutely convinced that 5 to 10 years from now in high-income countries, people will no longer be talking about economic growth as a policy goal.
But at the moment, at least, and maybe, I don't know if it's too late to change the narrative slightly, but this idea of perhaps we need to decouple the idea of growth from prosperity for the working classes and people who are genuinely suffering right now, because how do we win them over and this is, I know this is not what ecological economists mean, but it's certainly what comes across when sometimes they say, we can't grow the economy now, sorry. And to a lot of people, that is equated with unemployment and that is equated with poverty. And it's really hard to bring them on side when they make that connection.
But economic growth has not helped ordinary people in high-income countries for about 40 years.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's not that difficult to explain that growth in the economy is not the same thing as improvement in your personal standard of living, particularly in countries like the US and the UK over the last 40 years. But we're not necessarily talking about, in principle, the gross domestic product is an abstract number which could go up or could go down. What we are talking about, moving away from growthism and thinking about what prosperity depends upon. And it depends upon everybody having economic security, people having decent housing, enough food, enough energy, being able to enjoy a good quality of life, being able to participate in social provisioning and employment, paid employment is important. Perhaps one day in the distant future it won't be, but it certainly is now and will be for the foreseeable future. But none of these things depend necessarily on the perpetual growth of real GDP.
So you say, look, we need to move beyond growthism and maybe embrace the thing that's being called degrowth. And when we've talked about this in the past, Stephen, you've always said, look, we need to grow some things and degrow some other things. That's your personal take. And I agree with that. And I think that's why, just as you said a minute ago, GDP, you said it was incidental. I'd like to say it should be a residual. Somebody should write the deficit myth, but the GDP myth. And Stephanie Kelton's point in the deficit myth is it's after the fact accounting. People are falling out about whether growth or not growth should be the approach forward. And you've already solve that argument by saying, well, some things are going to need to grow and some things are going to need to not grow and even shrink. And to me, because the next thing you have to say when you talk about growth or degrowth is what you mean by growth. It's like, let's get rid of that. Let's just say what we want to happen. Like you just laid out a fantastic platform that everybody can get behind, economic security, etc. And anyway, that's just me in my tiny corner of the world.
That's where Kate Raworth is so effective, of course, in her donut model. But yeah, I agree with all that, Christian. I would say as far as degrowth is concerned, many people, particularly middle-aged people, they don't like the word. The 18 to 20-year-old people I meet often do. So sometimes it's a different term for a different audience. If you're an ecological economist, you talk about a qualitatively improving, ethical, sustainable, steady state or something like that. It's not a very catchy term. Or you talk about the genuine progress indicator and looking at the benefits and costs of economic activity and trying to maximize the net benefits of economic activity. Or you look at a panel of indicators, which is basically what Kate Raworth's donut model is. The inner circle of the donut is close to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The outer circle is the 9 planetary boundaries, which Will Stephan and Jacob Brockstrom and others identified a little bit more than 10 years ago. I don't have an answer to the best way of framing all these issues, but I do think that, sadly, in 10 years' time, this will have been dealt with. We won't be concerned about whether we call it degrowth or whatever. 10 years from now, we are going to be dealing with a polycrisis. It's going to come back a little bit to the Isabella Weber story when we're talking about inflation, because climate change and relating to climate change, perhaps pandemics and perhaps wars too, are going to create a series of disturbances which will have implications for prices in economies, and we're going to have to react to them. We have to move to 100% renewables, of course we do, but there are problems with organizing that without it being ecologically catastrophic in terms of the pollution that we cause, the old growth forests we chop down, the First Nations groups that we ride roughshod over in order to get the minerals and the rare earths that are necessary in order to facilitate all that. It becomes much, much harder if you keep growing the scale of economic activity to do that in time.
And even before that, Steve, I mean, all those things are incredibly important. But even before that, in the UK, the biggest energy consumer is the built environment. And we have a huge stock of very old housing, which is not insulated. And very quick wins, significant wins could be made by deploying some large-scale insulation campaign. And there are problems that there aren't enough people who know how to do it. There aren't at local level, and nobody's training them. These are basic things that we could be doing, and we're not, and it's quite disheartening.
They are basic things. I think MMT and a form of capitalism, let's call it constrained capitalism, needs to be employed over the next few years and to make investments to construct the infrastructure of a circular and sustainable economy. And I think in the short term, that probably does involve growth in real GDP, but you are then building an infrastructure which is going to allow you by the mid-2020s to focus on something else, to focus on quality of life, genuine prosperity, and to get off the perpetual growth ladder, which, I mean, if you just use just doing a bit of arithmetic, it's absurd if you extend it very far into the future. If we had 3% growth in the scale of our economic activity for the next 100 years, the economy would be 20 times the size. If you do it for 250 years, it's more than 1,000 times the size. Now, that's not going to happen. So at some stage, we're going to get to a point where we're thinking, in terms of scale, this is as far as it goes. Enough is enough. We need to try and improve people's quality of life, but that doesn't mean more and more and more things. It means better and better things and a better and better quality of life.
We don't want growth, we want genuine progress.
So we need to transform the way we do things. Like you say, it might take some growth in real GDP in some places in the world to do that. And like we've been talking about, the narrative against that has gone from we can't afford it because the government's going to run out of money to we can't afford it because there's inflation now, so that's that, to we can't afford it because we're worried about what bond markets will say about our proposals. And so just dragging us back into those monetary weeds a little bit, if we can bear it. We've got one MMT-informed commentator over here in the UK who's saying, just to paraphrase, they're saying, we can afford a green transition, but to do it, the government, and this is the UK government, but I think it applies to the US as well, in light of the debt ceiling drama that just concluded. But to do this transition, the government has to reverse quantitative tightening and restart quantitative easing. That's because when you combine quantitative tightening, which is the Bank of England selling bonds it acquired as a result of quantitative easing, when you combine the effects of those bonds entering the market as a result of quantitative tightening with any new bonds that will be sold into the market to match deficits associated with the green transition, that's going to push up bond yields. And as we've talked about, and we've recently seen the consequences of bond yields going up in terms of mortgage rates and volatility in the banking system. And so to get the green transition spending done, we have to stop QT, restart QE. And Stephen, my question to you is, what do you think to that? Is there another way to do the spending that doesn't even require bond issuance, or some other way to handle this bond yield question?
Well, in principle, we don't have to issue bonds. I think that might be a big step for politicians to take. So you could achieve exactly the same thing by doing the Bank of Japan approach. I don't like to call it quantitative easing, really, but you can have government still auctioning bonds if you like, but you then have the central bank on the secondary market making bond purchases to the extent that's necessary in order to control the yield on bonds, which was happening in the UK before. It could happen again. We had bond yield targeting in Australia for a year and a half, although they've stopped doing that now. Of course, they've been doing it in Japan for 5 or 6 years. You can go back to decades ago when the government used to sell bonds on the primary market to the central bank, and the central bank would only sell them to private investors when private investors were prepared to pay an interest rate which the central bank thought was appropriate, when bonds used to be sold via TAP. That's what it used to be called. Or you could, as I've been advocating for years, and of course, as Warren Mosler, I think, probably has been advocating for years, way before me, you could just do away with treasury bonds altogether. You can simply have funds being held at the central bank. It would be the central bank that was carrying the net financial liabilities rather than the central government, but nobody thinks the central bank's going to run out of money and the central bank could offer a zero interest rate on these reserves, or could offer a positive interest rate, could even offer term deposits, because after all, treasury bonds are just transferable term deposits at the central bank, really. I do think that perhaps treasury securities should just be scrapped because they mislead people. And I think people like Stephanie Kelton are thinking along those lines now as well. It might take the leadership of the US to bring that about, although I can't see it happening anytime soon. But no, we don't need to issue treasury bonds. They mislead people. The bond market cannot hold the UK government to ransom. The fact that they managed it with Liz Truss was that she didn't have any backbone. She didn't have any political support. She didn't understand the monetary system, and she was being badly advised anyway. That's very important to understand. We have to get past this idea that governments cannot fund the energy transition or investments in ecological sustainability generally. We've got an even bigger problem than that, which is that we have to somehow organise a transfer of real resources on a large scale from the global north to the global south over the next generation, because I think unless we do that, it's very difficult for us to achieve global sustainability. And when I say transfer of funds, that's not aid, that's partial repayment for exploitation, for generations of exploitation, which is still going on today. And that's going to involve deficit spending for some time on a large scale by global north governments. It will need an MMT perspective to bring that about, and it will need the advice of people like Nathan Tankers and Isabella Weber and people like them to manage the potentially inflationary consequences of doing it as well.
So in terms of what we should be aiming at, Stephen, you've recently been reading The Path to a Sustainable Civilization, Technological, Socioeconomic and Political Change, and that's by Mark Diesendorf, as you mentioned, and Rod Taylor. Tell us about that book.
Well, Mark Diesendorf is a brilliant ecological economist and renewable energy expert from the University of New South Wales, and Rod Taylor is a journalist. And I think sometimes bringing together a subject specialist and a journalist is a good way of writing an accessible book. And they've put together a really accessible book that introduces people to ecological economics and our planetary boundaries, but also discusses social justice and global justice and steps towards building a more circular economy, and discusses something that I'm very much not an expert in, which is the political barriers that stand in the way of a transition to a genuinely sustainable and equitable economy, both within national economies and globally, in time for us to build a better future so that future generations can have a better quality of life than us, not a worse quality of life, and can be living within a favourable and relatively stable environment and not dealing with climate crisis, after biodiversity crisis, after pandemic and all the other problems that will arise if we don't deal with sustainability in the next generation. It's a brilliant book, and it's an affordable book. It's been priced so that anybody can afford to buy it. It's about €30, I think, the price, and I recommend people to read it.
So before we wrap up, Stephen, tell us all about Modern Money Lab and what you've got going on there.
Modern Money Lab is a charity which was set up by myself and my friend and colleague Gabrielle Bond and a few other people a couple of years ago. We run a variety of events. We run a series of weekend intensive courses where we discuss MMT and ecological economics and state capture and trade and development and inequality and a range of other issues. We've done that now, I think, 11 times. We'll be running it again in Sydney on the 22nd and 23rd of July, and in Canberra on the 26th and the 27th of August. And we're going to be doing it again in early October, believe it or not, in Vermont, in Bernie Sanders land.
Oh, wow.
Bernie Sanders land.
That's right. Yes, somewhere called Bennington College. And I'm very much looking forward to that. We also are running the first and so far the only global online graduate program in modern monetary theory and ecological economics. It's the Economics of Sustainability program, with Torrens University Australia. We have students on it from Auckland in New Zealand to Los Angeles, from everywhere in between. That's a graduate certificate, a graduate diploma, and a master's degree. And we have people now for the first time joining us on single subject, non-award courses too. We have politicians, advisors, journalists, comedians, other professional performers. We've got at least one opera singer, sports people. We've got a professional footballer. I won't name the person, but a Scottish professional footballer, activists, retired people, new graduates, polar scientists, and the most amazing bunch of students that I've ever met in 40 years of teaching. And it's wonderful that it's been so successful so far. We'd like more people to join us, firstly, because we'd like to have the money to be able to offer scholarships to students from the Global South, which we're not yet in a position to do. And secondly, because we want big universities around the world to copy us. What's happening is actually the number of unis doing MNT in particular, and maybe ecological economics too, has been falling in recent years, not growing. Just as the world needs these ideas more and more and more, the old orthodox mainstream neoclassical economics has been dominating university economics departments around the world more and more, not less and less. The more irrelevant they become, the more they dominate major universities, and we want to undermine that. And I couldn't think of any other way of doing it apart from starting our own courses, attracting so many students that we demonstrate that there was a demand to think about these ideas around the world, and then having big unis copy us and make us redundant. That's what we'd like to do. We've got Dirk Entz teaching with us, John Harvey, Eric Dean, who's a microeconomist who used to lecture at UMKC, Colin Schneider, who's a very well-known ecological economist, and Stephanie Kelton makes guest appearances, so does Fadel Kaboub. They're both adjunct professors with us, so does Steve Keen. People have been so helpful because I think everybody understands that the world needs something like this. And I'm not saying we should be the ones to do it, but at the moment, we're the only applicants for the job. We're waiting for someone else elsewhere in the world to do something similar.
You've worked so hard for this to be the wonderful thing it is. So congratulations to you for that. I know in the past you've done conference calls or Zoom meetings for people interested in attending the graduate courses and the postgraduate courses. Do those still happen?
I'm not doing any in the near future. No, I am doing some other things though. I'm going to the Modern Monetary Theory Summer School in Poznan in Poland between the 5th and the 7th of September.
And you're actually physically going?
I'm physically going. I did it over the internet last year, but I'm physically going this time. And to the MMT conference in Berlin, which is immediately afterwards on the 9th and the 10th of September. And I hope to meet lots of people there, and maybe some of them might be interested in joining our courses. We'll see.
And for those of us who might not be able to travel, there's, of course, the courses at Torrens, but there's also, let's not forget, your pinned tweet, Stephen, where you have generously shared your first year money and finance course lectures, which are really helpful. So don't forget that. And then there's also the Modern Money Donuts podcast. How's that going?
We had to stop doing that. We did 2 seasons of that podcast, which was great fun, but we've had to stop doing that because of the Torrens University courses. We had some terrific guests, and they include Steve Keen and Fadel Kaboub and Stephanie Kelton and Dirk Entz.
I think they're a great entry point to MMT, to ecological economics, and they're there for posterity now. And maybe once Modern Money Lab takes off in the way we want it to take off, you'll be able to add to those interviews.
Absolutely. There's a lot of other stuff on the Modern Money Lab website. I won't remember the URL for it now, but if people want to Google for Modern Money Lab, they'll find information about our weekend Rethinking Capitalism classes. They'll find information about the Torrens University program. They'll find some publications, and they'll find some data, and they'll find the podcast as well.
So lots to look forward to going forward. That's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking to Professor Stephen Hale, economist and founder of Modern Money Lab. In the show notes for this episode, I'll link to where you can find out more about Modern Money Lab courses and the Rethinking Capitalism events, the MMT conference in Berlin, which takes place on the 9th and 10th of September, the MMT Summer School in Poznan, Poland. Applications for that close on the 30th of June. So don't miss out, because it will feature not just the exquisite MMT stylings of our guest, Professor Stephen Hale, but also those of L. Randall Ray, Nathan Tankus, and Yan Lang, to name but a few. For our Patreon subscribers, there's a link to where you can listen to the edited audio highlights of the book launch of the recently published MMT Key Insights Leading Thinkers, along with many other patron-only episodes. Check out the show notes for all of the above. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Professor Stephen Hale.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you, Christian and Patricia, for what you do on this podcast, which is very important.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.